It was the first one ever to open in England. And the thing that was outstanding is that all the people who worked there were volunteers. The pits didn't pay them to go and be trained as mine rescue operators. They volunteered in their own time. The Act of 1911, that immediately corrected this particular fashion and created a situation where mines rescue units were all over the country.
The explosion didn't kill everyone immediately. Many would certainly have heard and felt the tremendous explosion. Their lights would have been blown out immediately, and in the pitch black they tried to make their way to the pit shaft. They lived no more than 10 to 15 minutes as the oncoming afterdamp, carbon monoxide, overcame them. Many had died where they worked, quickly overcome by afterdamp. Death can be swift. The gas makes the body very tired, and you just have to lie down and go to eternal sleep. In the Downbrow Yard district, some 30 men had travelled 260 yards to within 300 yards of the shaft. We can only imagine their utter anguish. The explosion caused fires to rage that ate away at the limited oxygen. Dozens of bodies were found as if they'd fallen asleep, but covered in a layer of coal dust. There were just 3 survivors: Staveley, Davenport and Sharples.
By 6:05 in the evening, the surface fan was repaired, and the decision was taken by the mining engineers to start circulating air through the workings. After letting the fan circulate for about half an hour, the rescue teams descended once again into the mine. Those with relatives working in the mine were allowed to look at personal belongings to identify those bodies that were beyond recognition.
Police Constable Green, who was among the contingent of police sent to the pit, identified the boy as his son William, aged 13. And the only means of identification he was able to identify him with was the belt he was wearing.
On Thursday, the 22nd of December 1910, an initial inquest was held to assess evidence and begin the formal identification of the bodies recovered. A system of numbering and labelling the bodies according to where they were found was adopted. The formal inquest was not held until the 24th of February 1911. Now, rumours were rife that miners would be discriminated against if they gave evidence that was considered critical of the management at Pretoria, and this prompted the coroner to obtain reassurances from the Coal Owners Association that this would not occur. Bodies continued to be recovered until February the 16th, 1911, and funerals were being held every day, even on Christmas Day 1910.
The town of West Orton was devastated by the disaster. Individual bereavements are harrowing. One woman lost her husband and 4 sons. A retired collier lost 5 sons, a brother and a nephew. All the men in a small street called Waters Nook perished. One young lad started that very day down the mine, never to return. A lampman at the pit lost his sons to the disaster and had a nervous breakdown. 344 people died in the disaster. The total number unidentified was first put at 13, but was later revised to 23. 343 died as a direct result of the explosion. William Turton, however, died trying to rescue his 2 sons.
It is said that William Turton was down there helping, looking for everybody, but at the same time he had 2 sons down and he was desperately trying to find them. He came out of the pit badly injured and he died shortly afterwards.
However, not all seemed to be miners. There is a story that one man, Walter Woodward, was a sign writer who'd gone down the mine to do an hour's work.
There were the 343 miners and a sign writer. He was actually a joiner, and along with a man called Orlando Gerard, who was also killed, he was a fitter. He'd gone down at the request of management to measure up for a particular item they needed to be made and to be assembled below ground. Whilst he was below, the explosion occurred and killed both him and Orlando Gerard.
The manager, Alfred Tong, received the Miner's Medal for his bravery. Others performed deeds that were not rewarded with medals.
Emerging from the mine the next morning, he was shown the joiner's shop, which was being used as a mortuary. There were rows and rows of coffins. Here he was introduced to a rosy-cheeked pit lass of about 18, who, he was told, had herself alone washed more than 100 bodies. "Why did you do this?" he asked. "Someone had to do it," she replied, "and I lost no one. All the other women had." My name was Helen Morgan.
Let's look at the findings of the inquest. Some of those present were RAS Redmayne, Chief Inspector of Mines, Mr. Samuel Pope, on behalf of the Home Department, Mr. J. Gerard, HM Inspector of Mines, Mr. R. Nelson, Electrical Inspector of Mines, junior inspectors and representatives of the owners and the workers. The jury was asked to deliberate on 15 questions, including the cause of the explosion. Where did the explosion originate? What was the source of ignition? And was the explosion caused by negligence? Were due care and reasonable precautions taken in respect of examination for the removal of gas?
Of the bodies recovered, 92 or 27% were scorched and charred, whilst the majority were uninjured, found as though asleep, and there were 226 or 66%. Those injured by violence due to the explosion and rock falls were 4%, and another 4% of the bodies were unidentifiable because of the extent of the injuries. The sudden impact of a huge volume of air travelling at a rapid rate would knock a man senseless. The sheer destructive force of the blast can be gauged from the discovery of a huge fan in the yard mine weighing some 4 tons, which had been smashed into several fragments together with coal tubs and roof supports. As a result, there were extensive injuries to some of the bodies, including limbs being ripped out and some decapitated. All these facts indicate an explosion which would have killed the miners instantly where they worked. The explosive force would have travelled throughout the mine workings, an area in diameter of some 1,920 yards by 1,750 yards. Looking at the evidence, we can deduce where the explosion occurred. The patterns of injury and devastation indicate that the explosion originated at the number 2 face of the North Plodder. Shortly before the actual explosion, a fall occurred at this point, and men were working on it to pack the roof at the time of the explosion.
Concerns were raised about the wolf safety lamps that were in use. In a 9-month period, 1,200 had glasses broken and 198 were damaged, giving credence to the theory that a defective lamp could have ignited the fire damp.
It is very likely that another fall had released fire damp. This was ignited by a defective safety lamp or one damaged in the fall. The indications of the path of force support this. The large quantity of coal dust being circulated by the ventilating current, mixing with gas, which was then ignited, would carry the explosive force throughout the entire yard mine, destroying anything in its way.
It was known from the mid-1800s that coal dust could explode given 3 conditions. The dust must be raised in suspension in the air, a flame of sufficient size must be projected into the dust cloud, and a good supply of air is needed for the explosion to propagate. All 3 conditions were present in the Pretoria explosion.
Much was made of the conveyor switch on the North Plodder as a possible source of ignition, some people reporting having seen it spark. However, on examination, the electrical equipment was in good working order.
Coal was supposed to be cut only during the night shift. But was this the case?
Pretoria was the first mine to have an electric coal cutters. Possibly ignition from sparking carbon brushes on commutators with the electric motors driving the coal cutters was the initial cause of the explosion. The inspection window on these big motors, there was an inspection window as there is on modern day motors, but it wasn't glass, it was made of mica that you get out of coal, which is then used as a window. The mica was smashed, and the carbon brushes had to be inspected by the electrical people every day, because if they sparked at all, then you were looking for trouble. There was no doubt about it. So that was, in my opinion, personal opinion, that was one of the main causes.
Coal cutting, in certain coal seams you get iron perites called fool's gold. It does look like nuggets of gold. If a cutter pick strikes iron perites, it does produce a spark. and you can get sparking while the machine's actually cutting coal. If there's gas being released, which there's always gas being released from a coal seam, there is a chance that that can ignite. Iron pyrites can spark, ignite the gas, and then you start the procession then of the propagation of an explosion.
Looking at the legal aspects of the case, the jury at the formal inquest reached the decision that the explosion was caused by an accidental ignition of gas and coal dust on the conveyor face in the North Plodder mine in a manner unknown, but probably from a defective or overheated safety lamp. The men killed in the explosion were killed by accident. There was no evidence to prove that the explosion was due in any way to the non-observance of any statutory obligation. They did agree, however, that the exploratory headings in the North Plodder were undesirable because of the likelihood of a build-up of gas. The jury thought that the carrying forward of the heading at the top of the North Plodder was unnecessary and calculated to produce danger of gas. They were of the opinion that the failure of the fireman in the North Plodder mine to make his statutory report on the morning of the 21st of December showed some evidence of laxity of supervision, and they recommended that the fireman's report of gas should specify the exact amount found and the quantity, and a duplicate of that report should be kept in the office above ground. From a purely legal viewpoint, whilst there was some failure to comply with certain statutory rules, there was no breach of specific statutory duty. To justify proceeding against anyone, it is necessary to be satisfied that a reasonable case is made out that it was gross carelessness or negligence of duty which had caused or brought about the deaths in question. In the investigation of the explosion, there was no evidence that indicated any act of negligence as to the cause of the ignition. The jury returned their verdict that the deaths were by accident. A charge of corporate manslaughter could not be sustained, and prosecution was not recommended.
A relief fund was set up to help the dependents of the deceased.
The total value of the fund was £149,220 for 593 dependents. The last payment was made to a Bolton man in 1973. The balance of £13,000 was divided amongst groups aiding mining communities in the area.
Widows received 4 shillings per week and 2 shillings for each child. Payments for children ended when they reached 14.
There was general dissatisfaction over the way the compensation was allocated. Dependents did appeal against decisions made for compensation. One woman who did appeal was awarded more money, and this was paid into the county court. She was awarded £1 per week. If her children needed new clothes or new shoes, they had to face the humiliation of appearing before the county judge, who would insist that the clothes or the shoes could be repaired.
This letter came from the town hall in Bolton on the 30th of May 1911, and it says on the top, the Hulton Colliery Explosion 1910 Relief Fund. Dear Madam, to Mrs. Hollingsworth. As you recollect, the weekly allowances granted to you and your children from this fund were doubled as from the 10th of January 1911 until the settlement of the compensation. Such compensation having now been settled, the committee have decided that the allowance to you shall be at the rate of 7 shillings per week. This allowance, and I would ask you to listen to this very carefully, this allowance will be paid on the condition of your good conduct, and its payment will cease upon remarriage or misconduct. Now just imagine this being said to a widow today.
To update and bring together existing mining legislation, especially in the aftermath of the Pretoria disaster, the Coal Mines Act of 1911 was passed. The Act has 8 sections dealing with management, safety, health, accidents, regulations, employment, inspections and supplementary issues.
One positive legacy of the Pretoria and other mining disasters was a quickening pace in mining legislation. Virtually all the recommendations of the Pretoria inquiry were incorporated into the Mines Act of 1911, which formed the foundation for all subsequent mining legislation in Britain right up to the 1950s, and this concentrated in particular on mining safety issues.
It has been established that the severity of the explosion was exacerbated by coal dust. Pretoria was a dusty mine, and the dust was trucked out every week, and some roads were watered, but not all. However, this did not prevent a critical mass from building up. The Coal Mines Act of 1911